5 reasons why the Baltic states hate and fear Russia. 1. Russia has deceived them in the past. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are small. All 3 countries became independent after World War I. The Soviet Union recognized their independence, but in World War II, the tiny republics had no choice. They were squeezed between Germany and the Soviet Union. In 1939, Stalin made them an offer they couldn't refuse. To protect them from German occupation, he sent Soviet troops. The Baltic states did not want anything to do with it, but being too small, they had no choice. The Soviets then installed their own puppet governments. These governments' only act was to sign a request for annexation. All 3 former states became Soviet republics in 1940. The presidents of Estonia and Latvia were deported and died in Russia. The Lithuanian president had fled earlier. He died in Cleveland in 1943, and it might have been an assassination. Meanwhile, the protection scheme failed spectacularly. Nazi Germany occupied all 3 republics in 1941. The Red Army only liberated them in 1944. 2. The Soviets deported hundreds of thousands of people. In 1944, all smallholding farmers were deported. 10,000 Estonians were deported for serving in the Finnish army. In 1944 and 1945, 100,000 women and children were deported from Lithuania. About 60,000 people were deported from Latvia. Another mass wave of deportation occurred in 1948. In 1949, Operation Perboy saw thousands deported within 5 days. 30,000 Lithuanians, 22,500 Estonians, and 43,000 Latvians were expelled. This represented around 3% of the entire populations. All these people were sent to the gulags in Siberia. Around 15% of them died during transportation. They were supposed to be exiled in perpetuity. Only in the 1960s were some of them allowed to return. 3. The Soviets stamped out local cultures in favor of Russian. The Soviet Union made efforts to impose uniformity. Officially, every republic had its own language, but in reality, there was widespread Russification. In the 1970s, it spread to the education system. The Russian language was compulsory. Many colleges and schools taught in Russian only. Baltic intellectuals were routinely arrested, tortured, and deported. The Soviets did everything to stamp out any ethnic revival. The Baltic states were virtually isolated from the world. Their close proximity to the Nordic countries was seen as dangerous. The Soviets installed a large number of military bases. All military personnel were Russian-speaking. 4. Russians deny any of this ever happened. By 1991, the Soviet Union had collapsed. The Baltic states restored their independence. There were plenty of Russians living there. Most of them were descendants of Soviet officers. Decades later, many of them refused to learn the language. While it was available, they watched Russian TV. They celebrate Soviet holidays and consider themselves Russian. Russian citizens, too, used to come to the Baltics as tourists. They demanded everyone speak to them in Russian. These tensions had been building up for decades. In 2022, the Baltic states closed their borders. 5. The Baltic states fear a Russian invasion. Russia has never expressed remorse for Soviet actions. Instead, Russian officials call the Baltic states Nazi regimes. For years, they've accused them of stoking ethnic hatred of Russia. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the Baltic states sprang to action. They've been warning other EU states about the dangers of appeasing Moscow. No one listened, dismissing it as historical Baltic trauma. Estonia is Ukraine's largest donor in relative terms. It has donated almost 40% of its entire defense budget. Latvia and Lithuania are close behind. These 2 states also share a border with Russia's ally, Belarus. Russia also has an exclave on the Baltic Sea, Kaliningrad. A 60-mile strip between Poland and Lithuania connects it to Belarus. Russians call it the Sawalki Gap. They've threatened to invade Lithuania if it blocks the gap. In May 2023, Dmitry Medvedev, deputy head of Russia's Security Council, boasted,
"Today, all of the NATO member states go to bed at night and wake up in the morning thinking of Russia. Moreover, some of the especially cowardly and suffering from phantom pains, like temporarily occupied Poland and our Baltic provinces, have soiled themselves.
Our Baltic provinces. You can see why Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania would be worried.